Now, I'd like to call upon our next panelists who are going to be talking about India reclaiming our civilization's heritage. Mr. T.V. Mohandas Pai is going to be moderating this session. He's chairman, Manipal Global Education, former member of the board and head finance and HR Infosys Limited. Welcome, sir. Mr. Rajiv Malhotra is also here. Is an internationally known researcher, writer, speaker, and public intellectual on current affairs as they relate to civilizations, cross-cultural encounters, religion, and science. At the peak of his career, when he owned 20 companies in several countries, he took early retirement to pursue philanthropy, research, and public service. He's founder, director of Infinity Foundation in Princeton. He also serves as chairman of the board of governors of the Center for Indic Studies at the University of Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be India reclaiming our civilization's heritage. Over to Mr. T.V. Mohandas Pai in conversation with Rajiv Malhotra, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow, Rajiv, you have a very large fan following in Bangalore. Rajiv, Rajiv, thank you for coming back to Bangalore.
My pleasure.
We had a great conversation 2 years ago. I think people still remember that.
Yes.
And good of you to come here. Let me start by asking you a fairly long question. Over the last 5,000 years, we've seen many civilizations come up around the world. And today, if you look around, there are only 4 left standing. One is the Western civilization, other is the Islamic civilization, third is the Indian civilization, and the fourth is the Chinese. Why do you think only these 4 survived and almost everything else died? What is the raison d'etre of these 4?
Excellent question. It's very important to study the history and success and failures of these civilizations in order to learn from them, in order to figure out what's the right way for us and what's the right outcome in the civilizational game. So I'll give a little view on each of them and their strengths and weaknesses. 2 of these 4, namely the West and Islam, have been aggressive in the sense of an expansionist history, starting in one place and expanding, whereas neither China nor India took that course. And both of them considered it sort of God's mandate. God gave them a franchise to spread. And so they used their own means and fought with each other, fought with others, and did a pretty good job in terms of the success of capturing a lot of territory. Because if you look at the definition of the West, once upon a time it was just Europe, and even that Northern Europe, because Greece was considered part of the Orient at one time. And from there, they've spread a lot. The rise of the Americas was a big thing. And then you look at Islam, where it started and where all it has spread. Geographically, also numerically, in terms of population, they have done a very good job. Now, between the 2, before I go to the other 2, between these 2, Islam hasn't had the benefit of a reformation like the West did. The West also was very locked into kind of religious exclusivism and dogma and history centrism. And the Reformation in Europe, which took 100 years of war, a lot of fight, resulted in the rise of science and hence the modernity. Until then, bishops in Europe had fatwa-type powers. They could arrest, they could do whatever. And so the Western trajectory of Reformation is a good role model for Islam to follow, because if Islam is to succeed, it has to get out of its current prison, and it's not something others can do. I think the Islamic people have to do it on their own. Others can't from the outside impose this on them. And at some point in time, they'll either continue fighting to the death, or they'll have to have a reformation from within. And this reformation, I don't see it in sight right now. I have a lot of liberal Muslim friends, and I really admire them and appreciate they're wonderful people. But they are such a tiny, tiny voice, they will admit that the chances of overthrowing the mullah, the whole Islamic establishment in the mosque, is very difficult. Bringing in science, educating people, educating women would be a great thing for them to do. So as of now, Islam is sort of stuck in a pre-Reformation version of West, ideologically. On the other hand, you have to say that Islam has enjoyed a great geographical advantage because being located in the middle of Africa, Asia, Europe, where three civilizations meet, gave them a huge geographical advantage. And they've used that as middlemen, traders, middlemen, as their strategy. Now United States enjoys a great geographical advantage also. We forget that US is probably the only major country with no border dispute. There's nobody fighting one side, one side, one ocean, one side, the other ocean. Canada, Mexico don't want to fight them. So they have no resource allocated to defending their own territory. This is something quite amazing. No other country can claim that. So when you look at the prospects of America, this itself is quite an asset that the US has. So geographical assets and liabilities can matter. That's as far as these two civilizations are concerned. As far as China is concerned and India are concerned, neither really embarked on an expansionist policy. But there are differences between the two. India got colonized, China did not. I mean, they got colonized for a brief period, not serious enough and long enough to disrupt the continuity of civilization. India suffered a lot as a result of that. So this makes the two quite different. Now, to India's advantage, despite all this long-term problem of colonization and destruction and so on, there has been a saving grace built into the civilization. And this is a Hindu asset. It is definitely a Hindu asset that I'm going to talk about. And this is that the same civilization is encoded in multiple ways, just like the same DNA is in every leaf of a tree. So the same civilizational basic structure is in the festivals, it's in the dance, it's in the shastras, it's in the sadhus, it's in the temples, it's in your home, so it's in the architecture. So the same ideas and structures and processes are in multiple ways. In technology, you would call it redundancy. It's a lot of redundancy built into the Indian civilizational architecture. And it's an open architecture, so it can keep assimilating what it wants to without losing track of who it is, without losing its selfhood. So given these properties, India has survived. It's sort of like, you have a banyan tree and you keep cutting off many parts of it, but any part of the root will grow back the whole tree. So the reason Indian civilization survives is because despite a huge amount of upheaval at the top layers, the grassroots have been able to preserve this very diverse root system with so much redundancy built into it. That's, I would say in a nutshell, of where the game is today as far as civilizations go.
But Rajiv, if you look at these four broad civilizations and how they've grown, let's say in the last 300 years, you find the West has succeeded. The West has technology. They had the Industrial Revolution. They brought about the battle between the state and the church led to liberation. They improved the demographic traditions. They fought the great wars. And they flourished. They dominate the world. They're rich. Whereas you look at the Islamic civilizations fallen behind, except for the natural resource in the Middle East. India has been colonized, and India is doubtful about its own future. And the Chinese are only now coming up and starting the world. So what are the essence in this four civilization that made them go down and some of them maybe rise up?
Yeah, I would say that China is, I've said this even before the new millennium, when China obviously became very powerful, that China will compete for #1 spot in the world. And now everybody knows that's the case. And we can discuss in a moment what Trump might do about this. But China's, the three civilizations that claim to be wanting to take over the world are the West, Islam, and China. India hasn't ever staked that claim, that we think we will be the world power. These three have no embarrassment.
Is Indian civilization very weak?
Well, I think the Indian state and Indian governance and the Indian ruling elite have become so colonized. Even now, we are not a decolonized mind. The mind is still decolonized. So we're very defensive. We're very much sort of losers and victims and wondering about, how to survive. So the strength can also be a weakness. An Indian strength is that I have a survival instinct. I can survive. If the lights go out, I'll say, okay, I'll just light a lamp, I'll be okay. If the trash is not being picked, I'll just keep my house clean. If there's no electricity, I'll buy a generator. So this jugaad as a solution is a great asset, because if the lights went off in New York, there would be havoc. There would be all kinds of things going on. whereas the Indian improvises. The improvisation skill is very good. But the weakness is that since I can do jugaad and micromanage and micro-optimize my stuff, I don't put in the effort to figure out how to optimize the whole society. On a large scale, systemic thinking of a very large scale is only now coming, where people are saying, let there be this metro, and thinking of the whole national system is very recent. Otherwise, the tendency has been to think of me, my village, my jati, my kind of a narrow optimization and not a global macro optimization. That has been our strength. Chinese ideology, the Confucian ideology being the foundation, and even the modernity being built on top of that, has a very collective thinking and the ability to make a huge sacrifice on the individual level, the family level, the local community level for the sake of the bigger than me. The Chinese have that quality, and I work with a lot of Chinese, and they have this very strong discipline and ability to face pain for a long time for the collective good. We haven't had that.
Now, Rajiv, would you also say that the clash of civilization, which Huntington spoke about, is essentially a fight between monotheistic faiths and the polytheistic faiths of the East? Faiths which want the domination of nature, the aggrandizement of the individual, and power at the cost of everything else, and the Eastern faith which seek individual salvation, possibly living in harmony with nature, and appear weak because they're individualistic and not the collective.
Well, the monotheistic, the Abrahamic religions of the West and Islam, yes, they've had the advantage, because when you are the aggressor, you also have unity amongst yourself. A sales force gets unified, then brand narrative is very clear, because when you're out there selling to take over the whole world, then you better know who you are, what's good about your product.
Like Microsoft.
Like Microsoft.
Like Facebook.
Facebook. And any army has had that kind of a character. Those companies are like that, and Google is like that. I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about is the Googleization of the world. The Googleization of the world, by that I mean that, a lot of knowledge, truth, who to believe, what to believe, is being shaped by, what comes up on the search engine. And they have the power to manipulate what they think of you or me. I mean, they really have that power. Wikipedia has some of that power. So, while we think of all these are democratic, they're not. Let me tell you something. Wikipedia, my page, is wrong. I mean, and I can't correct it, because they'll say supply independent, peer-reviewed academic evidence. And you know what I write back to them? You have my wrong date of birth. True. I think
That's peer-reviewed.
I think they have September 8, 1950, which is incorrect. And I don't correct it.
Maybe you are wrong, Rajiv. It cannot be incorrect.
But my passport, driver's license, birth certificate from school onwards, very consistent, one date. What happened is, when you fill out these accounts, when you sign up for some account somewhere, I don't know what it was, they ask you to fill out your date of birth. So I just, for the heck of it, I used to fill out 1 something, and it would be January 1, just to not be worried about it. Then one day I just filled out this September 8. And they copy from each other. So it sort of became the normal. And so I tell them, give me an academic, peer-reviewed proof that this is my date of birth. And really, they don't have it. So it's actually a sham. And if you have fought Wikipedia wars, try to change some page, you will find that the democracy is up to a point, but you cannot cross a line. After that, there are certain people who control, and that ideological barricade is very tough to penetrate. So these Googleizations, Facebooks, Wikipedias, all that, is a kind of a new form of colonialism or imperialism, and we ought to be concerned about it. And while we're on the subject, I should tell you that in China, they have their own versions of these things, and you will not find Chinese government people or people in high security jobs, doing all their work on Gmail. But in India, ministers, I mean, I get emails back and forth, ministers just using Gmail. They have no idea that what you think is confidential because you wrote it so, or you deleted and the other guy deleted, doesn't mean a darn thing. And I think you will see a huge amount of, like Russia can hack the US election system, you will see a huge amount of scandals where somebody will be blackmailed, some senior people will be blackmailed, or maybe they already are being blackmailed, because a lot of their dirty laundry is in the hands of these people. And whatever is in the hands of Google and Facebook is in the hands of CIA. I mean, that's a well-known fact. So I don't know what to what extent the Indian government and all are concerned about this internet leakage and internet cyber security issues as a vulnerability in our sovereignty. But I think there is a vulnerability there.
No, but if you look at the broad aspect, you find that Western civilization, Islamic civilization, is about control of the mind, individual mind,
Yes.
because of regimentation and one sole idea. And it manifests itself in many ways in business organization, other place. The Eastern about individual freedom, individual thinking, heterogeneous thinking, and the freedom to think and to ideate. Now, if you look at this as a clash, going forward in the next 5, 10, 20 years, what do you think will go forward when the world has become one single global village? There's a free flow of information, new generations have come up, and you have technology at the heart where you can reach out to everybody else and nothing can be controlled.
So the flat world of Tom Friedman, who quoted Bangalore Nandan quite a bit, is coming to an end, if it ever was there. Because it's flat at the level of technology and travel and fashions and so on. But the rise of Trump, the rise of Brexit, is a return to localization. People are interested in local identity, local sovereignty, competition for jobs. And this is true because we have 7.5 billion people in the world, and they keep saying that 1 more billion, let there be more birth, 1 more billion, there'll be a zero population growth. We've been hearing it since it was 4 billion, 5 billion. And now we're at 7.5 billion, now they're saying it'll level off at 12 billion or whatever. So this huge population explosion creates pressure on people to create identities for surviving and for competing against each other. Because there isn't enough natural resource, I'm not talking about just land, but even water and basic raw material for, a huge growth in per capita consumption when there is also a large number of population expansion going on. So the rise of the competition for natural resources is forcing people to make groups and collectively compete against others. So China wants to raise its citizens, per capita income, and therefore China Inc. as a collective entity is out there. It's colonizing Africa. There's a lot of Chinese imperialism. The way they're treating Africans is sort of like the East India Company. This is a topic people haven't written about, but they need to write about it. So the three major civilizations that are out there competing collectively for their citizens, for their members, against others, is a trend that's going to accelerate because there is a bigger bigger number of people on their side that they need to look after, and shrinkage in resources. So I think on the one hand there is more free flow. We can travel around, information moves around. On the other hand, there is more intensified localization of competition. And these two forces the fight of localization versus globalization is going to continue. And Trump represents this, people think it's just a foolish idea, whatnot, but I lived in the US for 46 years, okay? It's probably more than the age of most people here. So and I tell this to Americans, they say, oh, you're a foreigner. I tell them, yes, I'm a foreigner and more American than most of you guys, because most Americans are not that age. And I'll tell you, I started with the age of, the Lyndon Johnson era. So I've gone through like 8, 9, or 10 presidencies. And Trump is not just a shift from this Democrat, Republican, back and forth. This is a fundamental change. Because for the first time since I have been there, the mood of the American people is not more openness, but we from first, America first. This America first, and this France first, and Germany first, and England first, this is becoming a trend. And so India needs to figure out, what is the India first strategy going to consist of? And India has got huge issues because we've got two horrible neighbors.
Yeah, we'll come to that. But before we come to that, one other question to get the base right. Now, how are these civilizations capturing their own narrative and trying to market to make sure they become dominant? What are they doing to make sure they're in control of the narrative? What are they investing in? And how do you see it working out when you have these 4 narratives running simultaneously?
This is a great question because the Indian grand narrative is where much of my energy goes to create, to define the Indian grand narrative. So in the case of the United States, the founding
Let's
fathers.
talk about the West.
Yeah.
I mean, the US is part of the West, but let's talk about the whole of the West.
Yeah, so the whole grand narrative has been such an important part of the success of the West because if you have a positive identity, you are a member of the winning team, you're more motivated, and you go and do various things for the sake of that team. It's like a corporate entity which has a good grand narrative in the eyes of the consumers and the employees is going to do better. So the West has invested a huge amount in universities, in school systems. You look at their curriculums, what they are teaching, what they are not teaching so much is all driven by a desire to control the overall grand narrative. You find that in Islam, what you would expect in Islam, in madrasas, that the grand narrative is what they're teaching. And China's idea of history of science is how they've discovered everything. And what they teach about Tibet and the border dispute with India is such that even a Chinese person who's a very dear friend, on that issue, it's so clear to him, there's no doubt about him that the Chinese position is correct. We do not have an Indian grand narrative controlled by us. Our grand narrative has been broken apart and taken over by other people. The Indology field started in Europe to control this from the time of William Jones and so on, and we never really took it back. Many of the old manuscripts and old artifacts belonging to our grand narrative are still overseas. In places like Heidelberg and Harvard and Columbia and in Britain, you find a lot of old manuscripts. We never bothered to even ask for them back. And when you go there and ask them, why don't you give it back, they'll say, nobody ever bothered to ask us. That's how it is. So we do not have an interest in controlling a grand narrative. And worse than that, divisive narratives of Dalits versus somebody and Dravidians versus somebody and Northeast versus this and that. There are all these divisivenesses that have been created, exacerbated, and these are fault lines that are really problematic. So what started out as fragmentation, ideological fragmentation, and then feeding the history as being fragmented and full of conflict, has become a reality on the ground. Now this happened it became worse in the Indira Gandhi era because Indira Gandhi needed vote banks to make coalitions. And they brought in this imported idea of subaltern studies. Ramchandra Guha and various people brought these ideas of...
I think Lam is a liberal. I mean, Lam is a Bengalorean. He cannot be subaltern studies and all that.
They're good guys. They're wonderful people. But the point is that the whole subaltern studies and history from the point of view of the victims in India, the women are victims, the Dalits are victims, the Dravidians are victims, minorities are victims, and they're victims against the overall unified idea of India. So India is a problem. India is the source of oppression, and all these little victim groups have to have their own separatist histories. This kind of approach to building the identities has been nurtured and fed from the outside. The church feeds its constituents in India, the Islamic people, the Arabs and Saudis particularly feed theirs. The Chinese fed their Maoism, the Soviets used to. So this, we have a mess of a narrative situation. We do not have, I haven't seen an initiative from the HRD people. I mean, Javadekar ji is a wonderful man. I've met him. He seems like a really decent man, wants to do a lot, but he just took over and it'll take some time. And there's culture ministry. There's many kinds of ministries that could play a role in the grand narrative of India. And I think when you meet them, they are well-meaning. They really want to. It's a very serious problem.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Would you say, with all conviction, that the West has a grand narrative of what they are? They treated themselves as superior to the rest of the world. They've been successful. The Islamic world has its own narrative based upon their own religion, and they're very sure, and they're very proud of being, proud of their Islam and proud of everything else. The Chinese are asserting themselves and saying we are the best and having their own narrative. And India has become the battleground for all three to come and dominate and to colonize our minds.
Yes.
Is that the battle that's happening right now?
Yes, the battle going on right now is, in fact, the clash of civilizations is happening here. This is the place where people can export. It doesn't cost them anything. For a trivial amount of their budget, they can fight the battle out here. And my concern is that in the Trump era, while there's huge opportunities for India to take advantage of, I also see a concern that there'll be an acceleration in Christian evangelism in India because the Christian evangelists are among the biggest supporters of Trump and he owes them a lot. Some of the appointments he made are very hardcore right-wingers. So the expansion of Christian evangelism in India will create more conflicts. And that maybe the Islam versus Christianity battle will get exported from Western territory to and Middle East over to India. This can happen. If there were a big eruption of an ISIS type thing over here, then you will see the counter backlash from the Christian side also on Indian territory. So and India is not thinking of these problems. The main thing I feel is that 25 years ago I used to go and talk about it. I gave a talk at Indian Institute of Sciences many years ago, Indian Institute of Science, on where is India in the clash of civilizations. And this was a very difficult topic for the organizers to get approved, because they said this is very controversial, dangerous, it's a very bad thing, you should not talk like this. So you can't even talk about our civilization, and the whole world is debating, discussing the issues of one civilization versus another, and we consider it an embarrassment, but I think it's a sign of progress that Bangalore Literary Festival can have such a topic, and it's very good at least.
Rajiv, why aren't we as Indians so proud of our civilization and the good things that's happened? If you go to America, there's American exceptionalism.
Yeah,
right?
American exception.
And if you go to Europe,
right wing and left wing both agree
both
on
have
American
it.
exception.
Yes, they think they're the greatest civilization.
Yes.
You go to Europe, they take pride in their culture, their civilization, their history. Okay, you go to the Islamic world, they're proud people. And if you go to China, there's a newfound thing. But India, nobody seems to be proud of anything. Everybody is in doubt and everybody is struggling. And you have the media in Delhi telling you that you're communal, you are this, you are that. The debate is not about civilization, about doing all the things that's good with us, letting ourselves get captured. It's more about, like you say, breaking India. Why is this Indian mind so very captured by negative thoughts and not very progressive?
Oh, they will say Kohli scored a century, cricket doing well, and Bollywood, Shah Rukh Khan doing a concert here. So the Indian idea of grand narrative, unfortunately, is pop culture. Basically, pop culture is the Indian grand narrative, and Indians have not understood the importance of deep culture. The pop cultures at the surface level is fine, wonderful to have, but the deep culture is sort of where people are confused. They've been given a negative view in the education system. Parents used to transmit this to the next generation. I think a couple of generations back, this stopped happening. People are chasing modernity in a very radical way. Materialism, modernity, those are wonderful things. I mean, I'm not asking people to become sadhus or anything like that. But there is a very important role of the Indian civilizational, starting with ancient history, starting with the roots of our culture, which is the Hindu culture. And we have to understand that. And there's nothing politically incorrect about being a Hindu and saying we are a Hindu nation. And Hinduism is an open architecture. It welcomes others. It has welcomed people. But others, the question is more about whether others are willing to accommodate and live within an open architecture. It is not that we've excluded them.
Rajiv, one of the big points that you see around the world is about secularism and a civilizational identity. The West has sorted out by saying the state and the church is separate because they had a problem in the dark ages of the church controlling human thought and suppressing people. So they broke away, but they still retain the Christian heritage. Now you go to the Islamic world, there is no secularism. They're very clear what they are, and they want the Sharia. They want it to happen, and they're happy about it.
Right.
Now if you go to China, well, their God is communism, and I don't know, now is capitalism, and there's money and all that thing happening. But in India, if you come here, okay, I mean, you talk about a civilization identity, you stand and say you are so-and-so, you're branded communal, and you're branded not secular. Why is there so much of confusion in a very polytheistic nation which accepts free thought, which accepts the right of everybody to do what they want, as against monotheistic nations where they say there's the only way, and if you do something else, you're not the way, you're not going to go to heaven. Why are we so confused? What is wrong with this country?
So, so far I've been giving the blame to others, but I should also balance it out by saying some of this problem is also because a lot of irresponsible Hindu discourse by our own people. Talking about, I have this discussion in Delhi with some people. They said, what's your view on Pushpak Viman, in the Itihas? I said that I'd love to have a joyride. If you give me a ride, I'll believe it. And at the very least, you should show me one sample of something, maybe a wing or a tire or something, or you show me a landing site. I will believe it. I'm a scientist. I need to have empirical evidence, and I can't trust something just because it's written somewhere. Similarly, nuclear bombs in the Mahabharata. I would like to see a crater which is radioactive. We'll go there with a Geiger counter, and we can exactly tell how long ago this bomb fell. So until there is evidence, we cannot just exaggerate and make a fool of ourselves. I'm just giving an example to show that there's a lot of chauvinism, bombastic talk. It needs to be backed by research. It needs to be backed by science and evidence. And we need to be realistic and reasonable in how we build, rediscover our grand narrative. So that's one thing, is reasonableness, balance, and responsibility in the way we construct our grand narrative. Second thing, we have to, and I haven't found that enough they have all these conclaves in various places, and one after the other they go on talking about how great everything was in exaggerated way. And that's not the way to build a narrative. The second thing I find where we need to improve, and I'm being self-critical because I want to make that point, is that the people who've been in charge of the Hindu discourse do not allow or encourage enough self-critique. We have to critique problems in our society. We have to solve those problems. We have a history of debate, huge amount of debate, and people going and arguing and toppling some prevailing point of view. I mean, Adi Shankara did that, but that's a great example we have, but so many other, thousands of other examples in history where, we've disrupted from within. And nobody has sort of burnt these people or thrown them out. They've prevailed. So today, within the Hindu community, we need voices that are able to challenge, that are able to provide new ideas, confront, and not be blacklisted and thrown out. And I'm as much blacklisted by the Indian discourse people as by the Western discourse people. That's fine, and I accept that I want to be true to myself. I want to be balanced and be able to accept what is right from wherever it comes. So to build the grand narrative, we must open up the discourse. The leftists have controlled the discourse way too much in the mainstream media. They've controlled this pseudo-liberalism idea, and all these guys, sort of second-class or sometimes third-class or fourth-class Western imitators, quasi-white, pseudo-white people. They have controlled this kind of a discourse for a very long time. And that era has come to an end, because all over the world that pseudo-liberalism, leftist is kind of being kicked out. India, of course, we are being more generous to them. We are being far kinder to them than in other countries. However, one should be also critical to the Hindu voice and the Hindu right, in that we need to create really world-class intellectuals. And that we should be very audacious and create more of them. And the old guard living on chauvinism and bombastic speeches and all that must realize that the new youth are not going for that. So, in India, I see the following. I see 25% of the people are very solid Hindu right-wing people. And 25% are very solid something else opposed to it. The middle 50% is confused. They zigzag based on, one election to the other. Ideologically, privately, they may be one thing. Publicly, they may be one thing. They're not really rooted in a particular narrative. I think the target and where I'd like to try to have my books and talks reach is that middle 50% who are not extremely in one side or the other.
I mean,
this
you
is a big
mean people here?
People here. I think I do want you to know, out of my 1.4 million Facebook followers, I do analytics, and 75% or more are between the age of 18 and late 30s, so young people. And there's a regional breakdown. The largest region is Karnataka. You might follow.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay, Rajiv. Now,
so I want to thank all of you guys, because for some reason, maybe
no,
they're more
we're not
scientific.
finished. We
Yeah.
got it. Now, Rajiv, there's an intellectual tradition in the West of
Yes.
debate, of openness and everything, the intellectual activity. The intellectual activity coming up in China. If you go to China, it's amazing what they're thinking and doing.
Yes.
In the Islamic world, it is there and not there. But where is the intellectual tradition in India? Our minds have been captured by JNU and the West, and we hopefully will see after this one eminent JNU person coming and debating something in Bangalore. Our minds have been captured by TV debates in Delhi, where people tell us that we are religiously intolerant, we are intolerant, people give back their awards, and just because there's a criminal event in a place where a person was lynched, the whole country of 1.29 billion people are very intolerant and don't deserve a second chance. I mean, these are capturing the narrative. Don't we have an intellectual tradition of looking at ourselves, debating about ourselves, writing about why is there such a poor intellectual tradition based upon evidence on ourselves?
Okay, so I think the forums for debate are being controlled. The forums for debate, whether it's the Wikipedia example I gave, whether it is this literary festival is a very open one. I like it because they allow people from all ideologies. Whereas the other very famous literary festival all of you know about constantly call me and ask me things like, will you say something controversial? Or will you be criticizing, what is your view of this person? I'll tell you very honestly, when I was invited here, there was no screening of what I'll say, what I won't say. Nobody said these things are not allowed, and I want to thank you. Yeah. So, you know, the forums are being controlled. The forums, whether they are mainstream TV, whether they are, the Delhi, the Times of India Delhi Literary Festival invited me recently. It was on Donald Trump and India, that kind of a thing. And, you know, I've lived there. I know this whole conservatism movement. I can talk so much about it. But the reluctance, this is the chair, the CEO of Times of India Group personally called me, and we had a nice coffee in Imperial Hotel. And he says, you know, the concern I have is my editor-in-chief says you are a very, what was his word, not aggressive, but very assertive right-wing Hindu. As if that's a kind of a problem I am supposed to apologize. Like some kind of a job interview where I'm supposed to say, no, I'm not. So I gave him many examples. I said, so-and-so is a very radical, extreme left-wing guy. So-and-so is a very radical, extreme this guy, that guy. I went on, and then he said, okay, fine. So it was, and you know, you should watch that Facebook Live of that Times of India Lit Fest in Delhi on this event. And you can judge for yourself these panelists, who they were, how much they really knew. They were all sort of the party line, very superficial, few ideas they have. So mediocrity, we have intellectual mediocrity in all kinds of forums. In IAS, I feel the same way. I address the Foreign Service Institute, Ministry of External Affairs runs in Delhi, and I've addressed them also sometimes. I see this intellectual mediocrity everywhere. People don't read much. People don't have a curiosity. They're just following like herds, bandwagon type following. And I gave 2 or 3 long lectures in India International Center in 2005, and where I talked about you know, India and the West and how it is going, what's going on. And this young woman came up to me and said, we would love to invite you to JNU to give a lecture, because what you are saying is very interesting, it will be very important, and I'll ask my professor and I'll get back to you. The following evening, in this series of lectures I was giving, she comes and she says, I talked to my professor, and I wrote down notes of what you said, and I read out some of those notes to him. But sir, he wants to know, are you left-wing or right-wing? So this is how stupid and dumb the people are. I mean, they basically filter you where you fit into their little profile, their grid, and then they decide what to think of you. So we lost the intellectual fervor, that intellectual vibrancy, because the people who are the gatekeepers, the chowkidars, they are too powerful. So my solution to it is we use the social media. We should start our own channels in Facebook, YouTube, debate them, argue them, and to help with the mainstream media, because we can produce more exciting discussions and new ideas, and the youth on our side with this new kind of interaction, and the old media will probably die out, is my sense of it.
Okay, Raji, my final question before we open up to all these wonderful people to ask you those very radical questions. Now, you know, what should India do in future to reclaim our heritage? You've been writing that our heritage is captured by Sheldon Pollock, is captured by Wendy Doniger, by Wendy's children, and all these people who go to Columbia, Harvard, and all that, whose minds get contaminated by the Western capture of the Indian mind. You've been writing about it. And in India, the mind has been captured by these lefties from JNU, other places, who think it's a sin to be so-and-so. So, you know, and the rest of us, like you said, 50%, mostly all of us are very confused. We don't know what to do. We're looking for the great Messiah to come from the sky. So what do you think India should do to create an intellectual tradition based upon evidence about our own civilization? And what have you been doing? What motivates you in the last 15, 20 years to fight this single rearguard action, to overcome this domination of Indian thought by the Western clique, and to open up the Indian narrative for Indians to come and to debate and to create and go forward so that our children will have something which is evidence-based, based upon a civilization which they will be proud of as India grows richer?
So this is a great question. My own movement is now in the second or third stage. First stage was I identified that we got a problem in the discourse, and I outsourced this to Western academics to solve the problem, which is a foolish idea. I call it feeding their crocodiles. Which means that you keep feeding this crocodile and he'll become your friend like a puppy dog. But crocodile will never turn into a dog because his DNA is that of a crocodile. And if you keep feeding him, he'll try to eat your arm also. So this business of setting up funding and chairs and whatnot in the Western academics to study us from a better point of view was a bad idea. I lost a lot of money doing it, but I gained a lot of experience on how they work, and I studied them in the process on how, when I learned what not to do. So then I shifted this to, studying this whole field of Indology and how India's narrative is being done, but from a Hindu drishti, Indian drishti, very typical our lens, from our lens point of view. And I've been doing that for a very long time with the help of a whole lot of people. Now, that is just disruption. That just allows you to reverse the gaze and disrupt. But we have to do construction. We have to do both disruption and construction. So if you're making a garden, you got to pull out the weeds and disrupt the pests out there. But you also got to plant roses. You got to plant new things. So the construction part is where we are now active. We are developing many conferences, many series of books, and people who are interested can contact me later. You can join this. We are developing new research, pioneering new research from archaeology, from Shastra, from practicing, social issues, a kind of sweeping humanities disciplines about India, but from our own point of view, made in India sort of a thing, the make in India, Swadeshi kind of approach to India studies. We're trying to do that and we've set up Infinity Foundation India right here now, this year, to further these things. And this will catch fire, because we are finding that many parts of the government are also very interested. They are saying that somebody has to do this. Government itself can't do it. It doesn't have the know-how and the wherewithal to do it. It's better that someone else should do it. Some big changes will happen from the government to help us, help people like us. Right now, if you look at the Indian Council of Social Sciences Research in ICSSR, they have a budget of hundreds of crores, and there are some 29 or 30 NGOs or independent organizations which are being given this budget. And they're all from the left liberal area, like CSDS.
Not liberal. Left is not liberal, right?
Pseudo-liberal. Okay. Pseudo-liberal. So,
whatever it is.
Yeah. So this ICSSR is controlled by the wrong kind of people, and they haven't been changed in the last 2.5 years. They are going to be changed, is what I'm told. And this funding pattern, we are looking forward to, we are hoping, nobody knows for sure, but we are hoping that the funding pattern will change, and the institutions that are doing good quality research on the Indian grand narrative from the Indian point of view will be the ones that will be encouraged. This is something, this apparatus was set up in the Indira Gandhi era several decades ago, and it's become worse. So dismantling the old apparatus has not yet happened. We are expecting it should happen early next year. This will be a very big shift. So we, in preparation for that, are launching our efforts on our own, and then others, I think, from the government and various other places, we are expecting will join us. This will require approach to rediscovering of Indian science and technology disciplines, many of them, reinterpreting Indian temples, architecture, the various traditions, rituals, festivals, social issues. The whole gamut of social sciences and humanities needs to be redone. It is that big a job that we have to do. And I do want you to know that Mohandas Pai is one of our supporters in this project. And I want you to know that.
I'm not an ultra-right, let's be clear. I'm a liberal, all right? No, I'm not a pseudo-liberal. I'm a liberal. I am a patriot. I believe in the future of my country. I believe in my civilization.
Very good. Very good.
And I'm a liberal constitutionalist. I believe in the Constitution of India. And that says everything. Okay. Rajiv, now I think we'll open up to people who want to ask you questions.
So
yes, madam.
Can they be near the camera, or the camera will go to them, or whatever?
Yeah. Yes,
Right,
madam.
ladies and gentlemen, we'll pass the mic around. We have volunteers standing by as well. Sir, you can point out whose question you want to take. and we will be more than glad to pass on the mic.
Yeah, one male, one female, he says. Okay, good.
Okay.
Or one female, one
So
female.
who is
Okay,
the first
there's
person
one
gonna
female.
be?
So let's have a female, or the female standing there. Let's have your question, please.
Right.
Good evening. I'm Usha Rao. I'm a proud Hindu, but today, if I say so, immediately, the people will say that I am communal. Yeah. So, but I think our civilization has withstood the ravages of time, and I'm sure with all our inherent weaknesses, our civilization will thrive. Because, while the Western countries today are narrowing down to America first, France first, and so on, we here in India believe in the dictum, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, So I think we have no problem. Our civilization will thrive.
See, Vasudha Kundukam has been misused. I mean, I'm happy you're a proud Hindu and whatnot, and I would like to, I encourage that. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, you read my book, Indira's Net, and in that you search in the index Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it'll tell you what it really says. It doesn't say that the whole world is, we know the whole world is a family. Not only human beings, but even ants and animals, all family. But at the same time, within my own family, there is a difference between each person. It is not sameness. Family has also, the Kauravas and the Pandavas are one family.
But that is
and
our
the, and the
democratic
Devas,
right, sir.
the Devas and Asuras are also one family.
Yes.
And Isis and us are one family. So it is true. But you must understand, our tradition doesn't say that treat everybody in the family the same. It says treat them in the context.
Yes.
Treat them according to the situation. So you're in Hindi we have Chacha, he's the younger brother, Taya is the older one. They are not the same, even in the same family.
Yes.
The way I treat my brother and the sister are different. The way the child treats the mother is different from the father. So one family, you don't have to go to the whole world family, just look at your own family. The different members have different roles, different contexts, and they are to be treated differently. And in the same family, if you have somebody who's doing something wrong, they have to be treated accordingly. So you cannot say, I push this button, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and I get out of the responsibility of having to hit hard somebody who deserves to be hit hard. So if somebody is a crook, you have to treat them that way.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Okay. So don't let Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam become a slogan for being weak, for not wanting to study the difference between this one person and that one. A judge has to differentiate between each type of person and treat them accordingly. He cannot say, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, everybody is same, all of you guys, all the
So
cases.
it's like the terrorists who are now being praised and saying, the terrorists have human rights and all the nice stuff, they should be praised. And why was so-and-so hanged? And, despite 4 Supreme Court judgments, accepting that, why is he still hanged is affront to the Indian nation.
So this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is being misused and misinterpreted. So I don't use it much. I think that I believe that the ultimate essence of an individual, the Atman, is the same. We know that. But as it takes forms, it accumulates sanskars. It does karma. It does various kinds of karma. And therefore the treatment is different. If you were to take the naive idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, then why, that was what Arjun said in the beginning of the Gita, why he doesn't want to fight those people, because they're all my family only. So that is the confused Arjun view. And it takes 18 chapters of lectures to fix him. Okay. So in a one-liner, Gita is the lecture to a Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam kind of a confused fellow, to bring him around and say, okay, they are your family, but you must go and get them, hit them.
Okay.
That is the important part.
Okay, anybody else this
Thank
side?
you.
Right, next question,
Yeah,
please.
go ahead.
Who would it be?
Rajesh,
no,
we've
sir.
got so many people.
Where
What
is
do you want?
where is the next question from? No. Okay, so this person here in this.
Right in the front, yes.
Next will be the backbenchers.
Yeah,
okay?
then we go to the back benches.
Hello, sir. I'm Rahul. It's such an
No,
honor to be
close
here.
back, close back.
It's such an honor to be here. One thing I notice is that these ideas from the Indian or Hindu drishti that you talk about have very few avenues. Like, there are very few people like you. There are very few organizations like, say, Swarajya. And they often face, they don't have any state support, and they might face like state opposition also. But with the advent of social media, there's a lot of openness. But even there, we see a lot of these clickbait sites which sensationalize stuff. And they're not very credible, and that's why they're taken lightly. So how can this be changed? And
So-
how can there be more. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. We don't have enough space for these organizations, and so we need to have more space. But I always like to look at things from a self-critical point of view. So you mentioned Swarajya, but Swarajya won't invite me here. You should know that. I just want to be pretty open about it. There's always some reason, this, that. They won't. So even within our little groups, few groups, there is jealousy, there is divisiveness. And why is that so? It should be discussed. It should be discussed. There is a prestigious Hindu conclave in Goa every year. I'm boycotted there because I will say things that are true, which are not biased against left, right, but really true, and they don't want that. So you see these conclaves and the people who control these forums also are like little fiefdoms and little ego groups and political groups where they bring their own kind of people. And somebody who wants to be true free thinker, maybe someone they can't handle. So our own Hindu groups also need to be opened up to people who are going to come in with fresh ideas, provocations, including criticisms.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Hi. My question is, there is a wave of extreme nationalism that is trending. And is this going to be disastrous? Because when we see in the World War I and II, the core ideology was nationalism, extreme nationalism. Is this also going to turn to be the same? And I have this very weird, when people tell extreme nationalism is always related to or connected to right wing. I just don't understand. Does it mean that people who are in the left wing do not consider themselves as nationalists or do not consider themselves as nation first? I just don't.
Good question. So let me answer that. Extreme nationalism is a bad idea because it means that people, when you put in extreme, patriotism is a good thing. People should be patriotic, but they should also be open-minded. They should be fair. They should be willing to say that, look, my fellow Indian is wrong in this case, and the guy from the other side is right. That is what if you're an umpire, then you have to say that, okay, the other guy did the right thing, and it's a fault or whatever, on our side. So it happens in sports, it happens in any fair play that you have to not be so much on a team-oriented basis that you can't be fair to the other side. So extreme nationalism is an unfair approach. But I also want to take this opportunity and tell you about the left and right. I don't know how many of you know, the left and right started after the French Revolution, when people who were peasants could also come and join the parliament. They could be elected. And because in France they were not used to taking a bath, French did not take a bath, they would smell. So French invented perfumes. They came from Egypt. British actually brought bathing the body from India, if you know. In the 1800s, the British wrote a lot of things that in India you do champi, and that became known as shampoo. Champis, their servant would give them a head bath, and because back in England there was no such tradition of bathing the body. So the French they brought this tradition of perfumes, and this perfume was expensive. So the people who were rich, elite landlords, they were all with perfumes, and the new peasants who were joining the parliament, they were not, they were smelling. So they would sit on one side, and the other guys would sit on the other side. There was no rule to that effect. They were sitting, the perfumed rich elite would sit on one side, and the non-perfumed poor peasants who smelling would sit on the other side.
So who is the perfume now, right or left?
So since they did not know each other by name, they would refer to the gentleman on the right saying this, and they would answer back, the gentleman on the left saying this. Journalists also picked this up, and it became the right-wing view and the left-wing view. And so the people with the perfume being the elitists and all that became the right-wing view. So I was asked this by Shabana Azmi in Salt Lake City about 15, 20 years ago in a conference on decolonizing, and she was invited as a chief guest. I don't know why, but they invited a chief guest. So she was like that interviewing me, discussing, and so I was giving all these views, and she also was very confused. So she says, but are you left-wing or right-wing? So I told them this business about the origin of left-wing and right-wing is because they did not bathe, and the one group had money to have perfumes, the other did not. And I said, listen, Shabana ji, I believe in bathing, so I don't have that problem. But then I did something little indiscreet. I also looked at her and said, "Aap bhi try karke dekhiye."
Okay.
Sir,
Yeah,
good
yeah.
evening.
Sir, good evening. It's wonderful to have you here and explaining to us about the beautiful bath that we have been giving the world. Now, in extension of that clarity of thought that you gave, now this Hindu Drishti, which we are talking about, is it an inclusive one wherein the Jatiyate, the is going to be eliminated and the original Varna system of orientation towards the capacity is going to come, where we become inclusive of both the left and the right? And we create a new system by itself
Actually, very good.
for the youngsters, I mean.
No, I fully agree with you. The issue on caste versus the Jati Varna is a very important one. I had a 50-minute Facebook Live this morning, today, with R. Vaidyanathan, who's a professor at IIT, right here. IIM Bangalore, well-known person. And the answer there is very detailed on how Jati is different, and caste is now a different kind of a system. It was not a hierarchy. And the importance of Jati, he explains, good credit internally, and security, social security, market access, innovation, collective innovation. So as opposed to the corporate structure today, corporate structure, where ownership can be by belonging to somebody else compared to those who are working. In today's corporate structure, you've taken over lakhs of small entrepreneurs running their retails and turned it into a conglomerate where the corporate shares are held by somebody who could be all over the world, who don't have a feel for it and who don't have a vested interest. And so you've deprived all the self-owned businesses. So the Jati kept the ownership with the people who are working. It's a collaboration, a co-op, if you will, of people who are working together, and they take the risk collectively and help each other who's in trouble. So this, if you understand the Jati structure, it is not the caste system. So I would say today we should have a policy that says that those who are underprivileged as an individual ought to be given help, but not because of their identity belonging to a certain caste. You see, I'll tell you one thing. In the US, when you have your kids going to college, they send you some form if you want financial aid. And if you look at the financial aid form, there is no religion criteria. It is individual income. You put in your parents' tax return if you want to claim this privilege. They do the due diligence on your individual situation as a person and as a family, and then they rate them in some formula. And if you are somebody who needs more help than others, you will be given better chance to get that help. There is no thing that says that you belong to, okay, if you belong to this religion or that caste, that is not the case.
I have a question, Rajiv ji. What should be the Indian narrative, according to you?
Well, Indian narrative, I'm writing a lot, so you can read. It's something that fills volumes, so you should read. But in a nutshell, it's our kahani, hamari kahani, who we are. So each nation defines who it is on its own terms. Some nations have defined that God gave them a mandate to take over the world. They have the exclusive franchise. So their narrative is defined on a certain event, one unique event. Typically it happens to be in the desert. In the desert, whether it is one religion or another religion, they're all desert religions. They belong to desert tribes. The origin was with scarcity and a lot of violence, we are forest people. We are forest civilization. They are desert civilization. So ours was in plenty, complexity, sophistication, intertwined, interdependency was part of the forest civilization. So the narrative of the forest civilization will be based on different criteria. It's not an angry God. It's not based on violence. So our narrative is our old history, our old philosophy coming through, going through an evolution, an open architecture, assimilating, accommodating, adapting, changing, innovating. So the many dimensions of this narrative would include, I would say, all the humanities. All the social sciences and all the humanities would be part of the Indian grand narrative. So probably the most important project the new government has not started, which it ought to start, is a ministry-level effort on developing the Indian grand narrative.
I have a direct question.
Hang on, please. Please, over. One lady there in that late con. Anybody? Any lady there? The lady should have the last view. No, not right wing, but we want there. Anybody there? Nobody? No lady there?
Over there.
Okay, there is one. Okay, that's the last one. Then you can talk to Rajiv separately.
Right, guys, this is going to be the last question
Accused
because
of being partial.
we have plenty
Hello.
more sessions that need to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
underway, so
One
this
lady
is
there,
going to be the
please.
last.
Final question by the lady.
So,
Yes.
Mr. Malhotra, you mentioned that Facebook and Wikipedia and others are technologies of the United States and of the Western civilization. At the same time, you mentioned that in order to rebuild our grand narrative, we need to shun mainstream media and take to social media. But if these are instruments of Western colonization, then isn't there a paradox over here?
Yes, there seems to be a contradiction, and I will tell you what it is. I will answer that. You know, sometimes you fight a problem with a solution which is also a problem, but you choose between the two. One is bad, one is worse. So my feeling is that the mainstream media is an impossible place for us to break through. The social media is a better place for us to operate from because we can break it past the mainstream media. However, the social media has a problem that is foreign control, but it doesn't have to be foreign control. China has put together its own equivalent of Facebook and Amazon and Google, and not only are these huge $100 billion type businesses, each one of them, but it gives the control to their own people. So the real solution is we should put our knowledge and content onto social media, but at the same time, the IT capital of India, Bangalore, should be developing its own equivalent social media technology right here.
Okay, folks, thank you very much. Rajiv, please give him a standing ovation.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for him. TV Mohandas Pai in conversation with Mr. Rajiv Malhotra, ladies and gentlemen.